Okay, we are covering the endocrine system. So let me put this in slideshow mode. All right, so we need to identify different types of glands. We have endocrine glands and we have exocrine glands. So exocrine glands are pretty much what you've been, you are familiar with thus far. Sweat glands, oil glands, those are the pancreas. It is part of the digestive system. They produce products that follow duct systems and then get liberated, someplace. In the case of the pancreas, it's going to be delivered into the small intestine. But sweat and oil glands emerge to the surface of your body. So they secrete products into ducts that then transport the fluid or their product. Endocrine glands use the bloodstream. So the product of these cells enter into the extracellular fluid and then into the blood and are transported as molecules within the blood. So we come back to these negative feedback loops that we cover periodically, with different hormones. And we're going to look at the negative feedback loops of about 11 to 13 different hormones. So we always start with some kind of a stimulus. Then there's a production site, which in this case is generally a particular gland or maybe a specific cell within a gland. Then we produce a hormone that travels through the blood to a target site. It stimulates that target to perform a particular action, and then you have a response. Remember, in negative feedback loops, your response is generally opposite to your stimulus. So if we start with, let's say, higher than normal blood calcium levels, we're going to end with lower blood calcium levels or maybe normal calcium levels. Okay, so the stimulus is a change in homeostasis, which triggers the release of a hormone. We have the production site is where the hormone's made. The hormone is the chemical substance secreted by the cells that ultimately enters in the bloodstream. And then its target site is the tissue where the hormone exerts its action. The action is reaction of the hormone that the hormone stimulates of that particular cell. And the response is a return to homeostatic levels, usually opposite to the stimulus or of the stimulus. Right, so hormones, chemical classifications or types of hormones. So we have two general categories, kind of like looking at blood. We said we have formed elements and plasma. Well, when it comes to hormones, they're either classified as non-steroidal or steroidal. So non-steroidal, they're generally amino-based, and any peptide or a protein hormone. They're generally water soluble, and they are the most common. And if you're non-steroidal, it means that you're polar covalently bonded. Water is polar covalently bonded. So most of them are going to be non-steroidal hormones. Steroidal hormones are lipid soluble, which means they are non-polar covalently bonded. And synthesized from cholesterol includes a lot of the sex hormones and hormones of the adrenal cortex. Another lipid soluble is T3, T4 from the thyroid gland. Binding sites of hormones on the target cells. So there's a difference between the mechanism that a steroidal hormone uses versus a non-steroidal. So a steroidal hormone, the receptors for those hormones are found to the inside, the interior of the cell of the plasma membrane. All right, so it's the interior of the plasma membrane of that phospholipid bilayer. The non-steroidal hormones, the receptors are on the plasma membranes on the surface. Remember, steroidal hormones, are non-polar covalently bonded. And remember, the fatty acid tails of the phospholipid are also non-polar covalently bonded. So these steroid hormones can pass right through those lipid tails and travel from the exterior, from the extracellular fluid directly into the cell. They don't need to have a receptor on the surface. And generally, these hormones target, all these general body cells. Duration of activity. Most hormones are removed from the blood by the kidney or the liver. Their duration, is limited, generally to 20 minutes to a few hours. All right, we have three major sources of hormones, and how or hormones and affecting and functioning within what's considered to be the endocrine system. So let's look at A. We have the relationship of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And then those hormones will be put into peripheral circulation, target cells, and you will then have an action. So the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, that route uses a capillary bed that transports hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus to either release or inhibit one of the 6 hormones that are produced and released from the anterior pituitary gland. And then that hormone travels to the target and stimulates some kind of an action. This is another portal system. In the digestive system, and when we looked at blood vessels, we identified the hepatic portal system, the hepatic portal vein, that transports venous blood from one organ to another organ to be utilized. And then the liver drains, the venous blood will drain from the liver and be transported in the hepatic vein into the inferior vena cava. Right. So it's sort of a blood to one organ to another organ, which is unusual, before it travels back toward the right atrium, because it's transporting our deoxygenated blood. But in the hypothalamus, we do the same thing. And I'll talk about it briefly, because that's what differentiates is the anterior versus the posterior pituitary. But we'll look at that. So this is source number 1 of hormones and how it's going to be liberated from the anterior pituitary system. Right, then we have the nervous system itself. All right, this is generally using the sympathetic nervous system, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla into the bloodstream. And so we have the nervous system being stimulated, an endocrine gland like the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine and travels to the target cells to elicit an action. So that's another way of releasing hormones, different than how the hypothalamus will. And then we have the stimulus that is simply just changing substance levels in plasma. And a really good example of this are the blood calcium levels, changing levels that we looked at in AMP1 in the skeletal system, how blood calcium is regulated with calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, that by just changing levels of calcium above normal or below normal will stimulate the release of these particular hormones. Another example of that is changing levels of blood glucose. When glucose levels go up, what do? Glucose levels go down. Right? So there's 3 different really major methods in which we're going to secrete hormones. This represents what's happening in the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. We have releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones that can travel from the hypothalamus through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary. The 3 hormones that we're going to look at primarily right now are going to be thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, and human growth hormone. But we also have hormones associated with the reproductive system that we'll look at in more detail really when we get to the reproductive system. But it's good to identify now all 6 hormones that are being produced and liberated from the anterior pituitary gland. But we're going to particularly focus on 3 of them and come back to them when we get to the reproductive system. Using the neural stimulus, as I explained before, this will be using the sympathetic nervous system. So maybe go back and review autonomic nervous system. That sympathetic outflow is from the thoracolumbar region. And 1, if not 2 of those neurons are going to travel immediately to the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Remember, and that is going to be one of the methods where we can target all kinds of tissues that we don't necessarily have that post-ganglionic neuron terminating on, releasing a neurotransmitter. We can now affect all these different blood vessels and areas of the brain and body that don't necessarily have that that post ganglionic neuron terminating on it. But we can put epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And as we increase the heart rate, then we deliver all these hormones very rapidly. And so we not only have a very rapid survival response when we're in sympathetic mode, fight or flight, but it's a very broad target as well. And then we have simply changes in certain levels of substances in plasma, and elevated and depressed or higher or lower than normal blood calcium levels is a loop you've already looked at in the skeletal system. But blood glucose levels will be another example. Okay, so here are our endocrine glands that we'll be looking at. The hypothalamus, which directs, secretions either, from the posterior and anterior pituitary. It communicates to the anterior pituitary using hormones in a capillary bed, but how it'll, communicate to the posterior pituitary will be a little different. And we'll talk about that when we get there. All right, so starting at the top or superiorly and work our way down, we're going to look at the hypothalamus. Then we have the pituitary gland that sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. You have the posterior pituitary that stores and releases antidiuretic and oxytocin. And from the anterior pituitary, we have 6 hormones: human growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and 3 sex hormones: follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. It's good to know all those 6 now, at least where they come from. So when we get to reproduction, it will be sort of a review. You'll be familiar with where these hormones come from, but we're going to specifically look at the first 3. All right, then we travel inferiorly to the thyroid gland, where the thyroid gland produces 2 hormones, T3, T4, and calcitonin. On the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, we find the parathyroid gland, and that produces PTH, or parathyroid hormone. Then we work down to the kidneys. We have the adrenal gland. The cortex, or outer region, produces cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens, which are precursors to some of the sex hormones. And then the medulla, or inner region, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Then we go to the pancreas. We have what's called islets of Langerhans. And this region of the pancreas functions in the endocrine system. We have alpha cells that produce glucagon and beta cells that produce insulin. And then further inferiorly, we get into the reproductive organs, the ovaries and the testes. We'll look at that in more detail when we get to the reproductive system. So how I would approach this, is adding layer to layer to layer to things. I would start by being able to identify, what the hypothalamus is and what's its function. And then we look at the pituitary gland. What's released or stored and released from the posterior pituitary? 2 hormones. Anterior pituitary, 6 hormones. And the anterior pituitary produces its own hormones and releases them from there. Thyroid gland, what are the 2 hormones? It may be the cells that produce them. The parathyroid gland, the adrenal gland. Start by the basics. Identify the gland, the hormones that are released from there. And perhaps the particular cells that produce that hormone, because in the thyroid gland, there's specific cells in the thyroid gland and in the pancreas, and start putting that together. Then you start to apply the negative feedback loops. What is the stimulus? What is the action of the hormone? What's the target, and what's the overall result or the response? So you start with the basic things first, do the same thing in lab, and then add more detail to it. Okay, so starting at the top of the head, we have the hypothalamus, inferior to the thalamus. We have the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior. There are other glands there, don't get me wrong. We have the pineal gland that secretes melatonin. We're going to hit on a couple of the smaller ones right at the end. So we have the hypothalamus, pituitary gland. Down in the throat region around the larynx, we have the thyroid and parathyroid. We have the thymus in the chest, but we did already talk about that. But technically, that is part of the endocrine system. But the thymus gland produces thymosin, T lymphocyte maturation. So let's move down. We have the adrenal glands, the cortex versus the medulla, hormones produced there. The pancreas, dual function organ. Some regions act, function in the digestive system. We'll look at that when we cover the digestive system next. But there's clusters of cells that function in the endocrine system. And that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, so starting at the top, the hypothalamus is the major integrating link between the nervous and the endocrine system. Input from the cerebral cortex, might stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system as well to help regulate body temperature, thirst, and hunger. So that's another method. The ones in red are generally the most important. And remember that the hypothalamus can secrete hormones that help regulate secretions from the anterior pituitary. It also has a nerve-to-nerve control system or communication system from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the pituitary gland, its location in the cella turcica of the sphenoid bone. It's connected by this little stalk region called the infundibulum. All right, so we have two major lobes of the pituitary gland. You have the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary may be referred to as the neurohypophysis, and the anterior, the adenohypophysis. And this is why. I'm just going to briefly explain this. When your pituitary gland forms embryologically, so when you're silly putty in your mother's uterus, the posterior pituitary portion is actually nerve tissue from the hypothalamus that gets pulled down, right, and then is captured in the cella turcica. The anterior pituitary is glandular tissue actually from the throat. It's called Rathke's pouch. And this glandular tissue from the throat gets pulled upward. And together they form the pituitary gland. They get sealed off in the cella turcica. So the anterior pituitary is actually glandular tissue composed of dark staining cells, some basophils in there, that can produce hormones and release them from there. And because, or let me continue and then I'll come back. The posterior pituitary is actually glandular tissue, with lots of neurons. So when the hypothalamus wants to communicate to the posterior pituitary, it sends action potentials, it sends signals down the axons of these nerves to the posterior pituitary because it's all nerve tissue. And then the hormones that are stored there, that are actually produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary, become released. That's why we store and release hormones in the posterior pituitary, because it's really nerve tissue, right? And that's the way the hypothalamus communicates to the posterior pituitary, is by electrical impulses that you're familiar with. Right? The anterior pituitary is different, right? Because it came from a different region, it doesn't have a nerve connection to the hypothalamus, but there is a capillary bed connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, called the hypophyseal portal system. So the hypothalamus produces these releasing and inhibiting hormones to communicate to these cells in the anterior pituitary, and those hormones get released into the capillary bed. The blood travels to the anterior pituitary and then now binds to receptors on the particular cell that it needs to communicate to either stimulate the release or maybe inhibition of the hormone that particular cell produces. And so I'm not going to ask you about these different releasing hormones and things. We will come back to that. There's only one, that you have to know, called gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that we will come back to in the reproduction system. All right, so the posterior pituitary is generally small, only stores and releases two hormones, right? Neural tissue composed of axon terminals that store hormones made in the hypothalamus, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary is epithelial tissue, glandular tissue, right, that produces several hormones, right? TSH, ACTH, growth hormone, or HGH, human growth hormone, FSH, LH, and prolactin. So this is the difference in appearance. And I tell you about where they come from because this kind of explains the difference in their appearance. So here we have the picture on top, from University of Kansas or Kansas University Medical. where you have the pituitary gland. And look, they look completely different. The one on the left-hand side is smaller and kind of pale staining. The one on the right-hand side is larger and darker staining and granular looking. So the one to the right is the anterior pituitary, because that is the glandular tissue, cells that form hormones. And the one to the left is nerve tissue, kind of stringy looking, like nerve axons. Okay, and the same with the picture on the bottom. That comes from one of the cookie sheet models, I call them, in the lab. B is the anterior pituitary. You can see individual little cells there, bigger than the posterior pituitary. A, nerve tissue stores and releases hormones. So you should be able to identify, this as the pituitary gland, which would be the posterior pituitary, which would be the anterior pituitary. Which hormones are stored and released from the posterior pituitary? Which ones are formed and released from the anterior pituitary? Okay. All right, this shows you how the the hypothalamus communicates to the posterior pituitary via nerve connection. And then those hormones, get picked up or transported in the cardiovascular system, versus how it communicates to the anterior pituitary. Right, it's going to use these releasing or inhibiting hormones into a bloodstream to the capillary, to the anterior pituitary, and then those hormones produced by those cells enter into the bloodstream. Hypophyseal portal system. So this is just kind of a schematic. Even if you want to start from here, maybe draw things out. The hypothalamus communicates to the anterior and posterior pituitary, differently. Right? What hormones are stored and released from there in the case of the posterior pituitary, and which ones are formed and released from the anterior pituitary. This shows you also, right? So these are the different inhibiting and releasing hormones that come from the hypothalamus, which is the top row. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to ask you about that, but we will come back to, I will say, to the far right-hand side, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's really the only one that we really look at, right? But the next row, right, that blood vessel indicates all the hormones from the anterior pituitary, right? All the ones from the anterior pituitary and what they target. So as a visual, it gives you a good clue, right? Growth hormones targets bone, muscle, and adipose tissue. We'll come back to prolactin and reproduction, but prolactin lactation would target mammary glands. Thyroid stimulating hormone will actually have a hormone that targets the thyroid, and then the thyroid will release another hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. Again, that will then stimulate the release of another hormone. And then the last two that we will cover in the reproduction system, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Those are released in both males and females. So we'll look at that at reproduction. Okay, so we're going to look at the posterior pituitary. We're going to talk about these hormones. And we've already talked about these to a certain extent when we talked about blood volume and blood pressure. So this should be review. Antidiuretic hormone. The stimulus is dehydration or low blood volume, low blood pressure, or perhaps high blood osmotic pressure or increased osmolality of blood. Nursing classes, they love that term, osmolality. Right? So increased osmolality means it's kind of like a hypertonic blood. It's much thicker, and has a high ratio of solute versus solvent. And that's what happens when you're dehydrated, right? We're talking about, blood flow in the first chapter of blood, and what happens when we change the consistency, of blood. All right, so the stimulus is you're dehydrated, you have low blood volume, low blood pressure, and or you have a high concentration of solute, osmolality in blood. Right, the production site for antidiuretic is actually hypothalamus. Then it gets transported to the posterior pituitary to be stored and released from there. It targets the kidney tubules. We'll look at that more when we get to the urinary system. And the action is to absorb water from these tubules that are producing urine. And if you have low volume, we want to reabsorb a lot of that water, try to, capture it and put it back in the blood to help increase blood volume and blood pressure. Disorders associated with antidiuretic hormone is a hyposecretion disorder called diabetes insipidus. Do not confuse with diabetes mellitus 1 and 2. That's something else. Diabetes insipidus means you have a low levels of antidiuretic hormone. So you have problems essentially concentrating your urine. Oxytocin is another hormone produced in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. Just know that those two, that oxytocin, is going to be stored and released from the posterior pituitary, but we'll look at how its, negative feedback mechanism works when we get to reproduction. Okay, now we're in the anterior pituitary. We're going to look at thyroid stimulating hormone. The stimulus for the release of thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be low levels of T3, T4, another hormone. So as this hormone, technically two, but T3 and T4 become lower than normal, then we're going to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And that's going to be produced in the anterior pituitary. It targets follicular cells of the thyroid gland. And the response is going to be to release more T3, T4 and elevate the level back to a normal range. When we get to the thyroid gland, we're going to look at all right, so what does T3, T4 do? And so this is a two-step process. Right? We do this for the thyroid gland, and we do it for adrenal corticotropic hormone in the adrenal cortex. Okay, so the stimulus is just a low level of T3, T4. We're going to keep it simple. Production site is the anterior pituitary, targets the thyroid, specifically the follicular cells of the thyroid gland, because they're two different regions. And the response is to increase T3, T4. So from the hypothalamus, we have, it's called thyroid releasing hormone. Don't worry about that. Anterior pituitary secretes thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid gland releases some of those hormone levels, T3, T4. And when they get high enough, we essentially shut this off and leave it be. Once it comes back into normal ranges, you're going to stop releasing thyroid stimulating hormone, and then the thyroid gland stops producing more T3, T4 because it's in a normal range. Typical negative feedback mechanism. All right, then we have adrenal corticotropic hormone. The stimulus is lower than normal or drops in what's called cortisol levels. Again, this is going to be kind of like thyroid stimulating hormone, is that when some other level, a hormone becomes lower than normal, we're going to release a stimulating hormone, so to speak, from the adrenal cortex, from the anterior pituitary to stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce more of that hormone. All right, so we have a decrease in cortisol levels. That is a particular hormone, generally associated with long-term stress and the mechanisms we use to deal with long-term stress. That's generally your stimulus. The production site is the anterior pituitary. It's going to target the adrenal cortex to release more cortisol. Right? We will look at what cortisol does when we get to the adrenal gland. All right, then we have human growth hormone. This is easier in a way. The stimulus is lower levels or decreased levels of human growth hormone. It's produced in the anterior pituitary, as you know. It will target, like that picture indicated, liver, bones, skeletal muscles. So what is it going to do? It increases the human growth hormone levels, which increases mitosis rate, protein synthesis, a lot of cellular repair, and it will increase, blood glucose levels to let these processes happen. Right. So it's human growth hormone really isn't being released due to changing levels of blood glucose. What we're saying is that when it comes to human growth hormone, which is, keep in mind that the way this hormone works different from, let's say, T3, T4 and some others, and like, let's say, insulin, is that this is about repairing tissue after you've been using your body all day, and everything needs a rest period and to replace cells that maybe are dying off, or proteins that need to be repaired, especially like muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, after you've been working hard. And so it increases the mitosis rate, increases protein synthesis, cellular repair. Think about the processes after you've been working out or exercising hard. And to do that, you need to give them some food essentially. So we're going to increase the glucose levels some, right? So that the cells have some food for these active processes of cellular repair, mitosis rate, and the protein synthesis. Hopefully that will make sense. Disorders associated with human growth hormone, we have hypersecretion orders and we have hyposecretion. Hypersecretion in childhood is called giantism. If it's an adult onset, it's called acromegaly. Hyposecretion, we have only one for you to know. If it occurs during childhood or infancy, it is pituitary dwarfism. All right, so 2 hypersecretion disorders, depending on the age of onset, 1 hyposecretion order. All right, FSH, LH, and prolactin covered in repro. Okay, now we're going to move down into the, the throat area, the larynx, to the thyroid gland. Butterfly-shaped gland located, on the trachea, inferior and anterior to the larynx. So we're in the neck area. We have 2 hormones, arguably 3 hormones that are produced there, because some people consider T3 separate from T4, and they actually are different molecules, and they are broken out separately on blood analysis. So we have T3, T4 that are produced by what's called the follicular cells, and calcitonin produced by the parafollicular cells. Now, you should be familiar with that phrase, the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, because in AMP1, where we looked at the negative feedback loop for calcium regulation, we identified that. We said, when the source of calcitonin, when you have higher than normal blood calcium levels, are the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, and tried to start training you for that, because when we get to the thyroid gland, there are also follicular cells, and they produce these different cells, different hormones. All right, so let's take a look at it, because that might be a little bit easier. Here we have the thyroid gland, right? Over to the right, we see a slide. And if it had a little less magnification, you would see, these different follicles. And a follicle is a layer of cells with fluid in a lumen here. And if we backed it up a little bit, you would see the repeating nature of these follicles. And they're sort of different sizes, because it depends on kind of how you produce this histological slide. But over here, we're pointing to the parafollicular cells versus the follicular cells. The follicular cells here up at the top might be easier to see. The follicular cells are the first layers of cells that surround this kind of tube or hose that has that pink staining material in the center or in the lumen. All right, so you have a single layer tube, kind of a hose, with pink, in this case, pink staining fluid in the center. All right. So that single layer cells that form the wall of that tube are the follicular cells. And the material in the center, the pink material, is the T3, T4. T3 means, triiodothyronine, which means 3 iodine molecules, and T4 is technically tetraiodothyronine, 4 iodine molecules. Right. And iodine takes up stain. So the T3, T4 here takes up stain when you're preparing these slides, which is really, this is the only gland that does that. So that becomes a really easy way to identify a slide and identify that it comes from the thyroid gland. And once you know the thyroid gland, then you're going to know the parathyroid gland. All right, so the cells that immediately are to the periphery of this follicle, that tube, those are the follicular cells. They produce T3, T4. But clusters of cells, and I would say that the arrows for the parafollicular cells, I would shift that to the left somewhat. Do you see these clusters of cells that are just amassed there, like a lump of cells, between the follicular cells? Those would be the parafollicular cells. Right? So when you find a cluster of cells that aren't forming a wall around one of these tubes, one of these follicles, then they are the parafollicular cells, and they produce calcitonin. The stimulus for the follicular cells to release more of that T3, T4 will be thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary binding to them, and they put out more of that T3, T4 into the lumen. The parafollicular cells, the stimulus for the release of that hormone, calcitonin, is the varying levels of blood calcium levels, right? So when blood calcium levels go higher than normal, that is the stimulus for those parafollicular cells to release calcitonin. Okay, so we're going to look at T3, T4 first. The stimulus is thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary binding to them. T3, T4 is released, and the target is all body cells. What is the response? Increase your metabolic rate. Increase the metabolic rate. Your metabolic rate, is really different from stimulating protein synthesis and cellular repair. Metabolic rate is really about how efficiently, think of it this way. And I will just say that T3, T4 has other functions too, but to help you discriminate more uniquely the difference between like human growth hormone versus T3, T4 versus cortisol, because they have a little overlapping in there, is that I want to identify some things that are kind of unique with specific terms kind of associated with that hormone. Right? So increasing mitosis rate and protein synthesis, cellular repair after being used all day, that's going to be human growth hormone. Ding, ding, ding. T3, T4, increasing your metabolic rate. And your metabolic rate is the efficiency in which your cells can convert molecules like glucose to energy, to ATP. So you want that to be very efficient, to burn glucose and carbohydrates, to burn fat when you need it. You want to be very efficient. All right. So TSH binding to those follicular cells stimulate them to release more T3, T4. And the more T3, T4 you have, the higher metabolic rate you have. And you efficiently convert, energy or cells to convert substrates into energy. All right, disorders, hyposecretion disorder. We have two, again, depending on the age of the individual. Adult onset of hyposecretion of T3, T4 is called myxedema. And hyposecretion in infants, right, of T3, T4 is called cretinism. We have one hypersecretion order I want you to know, and that's called Graves' disease. Both myxedema and Graves' disease are what's called autoimmune disorders, which means that, we were talking about immunity. We talked about the different antibodies and how we're not, normally we do not produce antibodies to our own body cells because we should have the right MHC complexes, those MHC1s on the surface of the cell, so that, your white blood cells can correctly identify self cells versus invading, cells or invading organisms and things. But if something goes wrong and you start to identify some of your normal body cells as being foreign, you start making antibodies to them, maybe to the particular cell that produces something, or maybe the receptor on a particular cell, but you start, attacking either a receptor or a particular cell that produces something, and you start to kill them off either very rapidly or maybe just slowly and gradually. And myxedema and Graves' disease are examples of autoimmune disorders. Calcitonin. So calcitonin, the stimulus for calcitonin is high blood calcium levels, like you learned in EMP1. Production site of the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. The target is osteoclasts and bone, as you know. The response is to inhibit the osteoclast to decrease bone resorption, because if calcium levels are high, osteoclasts, break down bone. So we want to inhibit them. And so you don't keep putting more calcium in the blood. And we stimulate the osteoblast because this is a good time to take the extra calcium that we have in blood and store it. Remember, osteoblasts build up bone. And thus we decrease blood calcium levels back into a normal range. Right, then we go to the parathyroid glands. They're located on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So if we could pull off our thyroid gland and look at the back side of it, we see these marbles, kind of look like marbles stuck to the back of the thyroid gland, and those are the parathyroid glands. They secrete parathyroid hormone. So if we look at the back of the thyroid gland, they kind of look like little marbles stuck in there. You know, those are the parathyroid glands. Produce parathyroid hormone, only one hormone, thankfully. But as you know, we looked at parathyroid hormone in AMP1. So we're going to look at how it works. It's a little more complicated than the thyroid gland. So the stimulus for PTH is low blood calcium levels. Production site is the parathyroid gland. It targets the osteoclasts, the kidneys, and the intestines overall. But how does it do it? Well, it stimulates the osteoclasts to resorb bone, because now we want to stimulate those osteoclasts, use all those lysosomes, right? Break down and dissolve some of that compact bone so the calcium that's stored in there can now enter into the bloodstream and start to increase your blood calcium levels. Right? It stimulates the kidneys to, one, resorb more calcium that's passing through there, because if we're forming urine, you know, that eventually is going to be just, you know, eliminated from the body. If it has calcium in there, why pee it away if we could use it, you know, if we need it? So you're going to reabsorb calcium, if there is any, you know, that's passing through the kidneys essentially, and put it in the blood. We also activate vitamin D. We convert it from the inactive form of vitamin D to calcitriol. And calcitriol then is the active form. It's going to travel to the small intestine to absorb calcium that's passing through there, and thus increase blood calcium levels. When you're low in things, a lot of times the method that you're going to use to increase it is going to be a little more complicated than when you just have an excess of something. All right, so parathyroid hormone works very hard to increase your blood calcium levels. It targets bone cells, it reabsorbs calcium at the kidneys, it converts vitamin D to calcitriol, so then you can absorb calcitriol, targets the small intestine to absorb calcium or more calcium. There are a few hyper and hypo type of disorders associated with parathyroid hormone. I don't ask you about them, but there are, any of these glands can have hyper or hypo secretion associated with them. And when that happens, then we often assign a particular name to that disorder or that pathology. But in this case, you know, it just gives you some ideas that, you know, we can have hyper secretion generally when we have a tumor, or hyposecretion if we have them removed, which, you know, if you do have any kind of, generally some kind of thyroid cancer, they will take out the entire thyroid gland and the parathyroids with it. So you might not have started with a parathyroid gland issue, but you might have had a thyroid, let's say tumor or cancer, and then taking out the thyroid gland to take the parathyroids, and now you're hypoparathyroid, if that makes sense. Okay. All right, so here, this is just a picture that shows you the negative feedback loop, you know, for low blood calcium levels and how parathyroid hormone works. Multiple sites. If you're good, you know, you like looking at pictures and making a connection with it, this is perfect. We start with low blood calcium levels, we end with higher or normal blood calcium in blood at the bottom. Okay, then we move on to the adrenal glands. We have two regions, the cortex and the medulla. It has two layers. Cortex always means the outer region, the outer layer, which produces steroid hormones, or I call it the salt, sugar, and sex, because it goes in that order from superficial to deep: aldosterone, cortisol, and the androgens. We really look at aldosterone and cortisol. But aldosterone affects salt levels, it manipulates salt levels, right, to draw fluid into the bloodstream. Cortisol often ends up with elevating blood glucose levels, and sex associated with androgens because they're precursors to a lot of the sex hormones. Salt, sugar, and sex. Right, the medulla is the inner core, you know, of the postganglionic sympathetic neurons, which or as the inner core of postganglionic sympathetic neurons, which secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the adrenal medulla, right? You have cells that produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, and when stimulated, release the epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream as part of the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so here we're looking at the adrenal gland at the superior pole of the kidneys. You have the outer region, the cortex, and the inner region, the medulla. You can see these different layers. You have a zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Each zone produces a different hormone. I don't ask you about the zones, but you should know that aldosterone is more superficial. Then we have cortisol, and deeper to that, the androgens. And then in the medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So what does aldosterone do? Again, we did talk about this when we talked about blood volume and blood pressure. But aldosterone, the stimulus is very similar to antidiuretic. Decreased blood volume, therefore, decreased blood pressure, increased osmolality, and another reason for secreting it have nothing to do, or have very little to do with blood volume and blood pressure, but because you have increased potassium levels, higher than normal potassium levels in blood. The production site is the adrenal cortex. It targets the kidney tubules. And the response is to increase sodium absorption into blood. Where sodium goes, chloride goes. So it draws water with it. And as a consequence of doing that, we secrete potassium into the filtrate, into the tubule, which is producing urine. And so we reabsorb sodium. It stimulates, we don't just reabsorb it, we actively pump it, I guess I should say. Actively pump, which takes ATP, because we've released antidiuretic hormone and we've allowed as much water to pass through those aquaporins and just diffuse into the cardiovascular system, kind of following its passive, osmotic pathway. And when that doesn't really work well enough, then we start dragging and pumping sodium. Chloride goes with it. Water follows. Where salt goes, water goes. But then we have to secrete potassium, and that eventually goes out into urine. At the end of this, we increase our blood volume and blood pressure, or perhaps if we are stimulating the release of aldosterone because maybe our potassium levels are too high. Remember, these levels, potassium levels, can really irritate cardiac muscle contraction and interfere with normal cardiac muscle contraction. So if it's going too high, we can release aldosterone and try to dump some of that potassium into urine to try to restore our blood potassium levels back to normal. And as a reminder too, is that because if we do not properly maintain our blood volume and blood pressure, and we start using too much aldosterone, now we're losing too much potassium. Remember, potassium levels higher or lower than normal affect how cardiac muscle can work. So if we're releasing too much aldosterone, and that's not shutting off, and we're not restoring our blood volume, blood pressure, and we start using the renin-angiotensin loop, that we may be losing too much potassium, and now we're becoming what's called hypokalemic, and that can irritate, the heart muscle also. So keep that in mind when you get into nursing, that there are some things you can do to alter this. Okay, then we get to cortisol. Cortisol, the stimulus for release, is adrenal corticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. Targets adrenal cortex, and we release cortisol, and that targets muscles, liver, adipose tissue. Extraordinary amount of and targets of cells and general body cells. What is its response? Increased blood cortisol levels, which increases ATP levels. So essentially, you're doing a lot of the things that epinephrine and norepinephrine would kind of do, but this is over long-term accommodation to stress, right? Both psychological and physical stress. So we're increasing ATP levels, we're inhibiting basophils, which means it has like an anti-inflammatory response. So in lab, someone shows you a picture of a basophil from those models from the first blood lab. We're going, okay, what's the effect of cortisol on this cell? You're going to say it inhibits it. And in doing so, it not only affects the basophils, but it actually inhibits what's called the secretion of interleukin 2, which is one of those chemicals that helps communicate with your immune system to let you know that you have an invader, to help amplify your immune system response. And if it inhibits that, then it's inhibiting your immune response. So when you're under a lot of stress, you essentially, one way or the other, often inhibit your immune system. And that's why they say, when you're under a lot of stress, you're more likely to get like a cold or a flu, or you could get sick. Is because technically there's some truth in that, cortisol can, depress your immune system, not completely, but it can make you more susceptible, especially if you get exposed to, a good amount of a viral load, that is maybe previously you wouldn't have become ill from it because your lymphocytes would have reacted very quickly, but perhaps if you are under a lot of stress, what you had got exposed to before now can, develop into, let's say, a cold or a flu. Right, we have two disorders associated with this. Hypersecretion is called Cushing's disease. Hyposecretion is called Addison's disease. Often it's aldosterone and cortisol, but just keep cortisol in mind. Hypersecretion of cortisol, Cushing's disease. Hyposecretion, Addison's disease. All right, then we go to the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine. The stimulus is stimulating the nervous system, right? Short-term stress responses, all right? So the production site of epinephrine and norepinephrine is the adrenal medulla, enters the bloodstream, targets all kinds of organs, the heart, the blood vessels, the lungs, the liver, all right? What are some of their responses? Right? Well, when it targets the heart, it increases heart rate, right? When it targets the lungs, it will dilate bronchioles and increase ultimately respiratory rates, right? We want to open up our air pathway, have the least amount of resistance, and then increase your respiratory rate. Blood vessels, it can vasoconstrict some and vasodilate others. It depends where the blood is traveling. Remember, we want to vasoconstrict to digestive organs and to the skin, and vasodilate to skeletal muscle, to the heart, to the lungs. And we want to increase blood glucose levels, because if we're preparing for fight or flight and we want to run like hell, for 3 minutes or so, then we are going to release glucagon, that we're going to talk about in just a minute, to target the liver, to start breaking down a lot of that glycogen that's stored there into the little, building blocks of glucose, and put it into the blood to make it available, right, to be used by cells. We're going to vasoconstrict and slow down the gut system, because we don't have time to transport it from the small intestine to the liver, modify, it's just, your mechanism is going to be to slow down gut motility, anything passing through the digestive system and the blood there. We're going to go right to the liver and try to take back, our stored polysaccharide there, break it down into building blocks and make it available for cells. So hormones of the adrenal medulla, it differentiates in this, and this is from your textbook, from epinephrine to norepinephrine, the effects on the heart, blood vessels, systemic blood pressure, airways, the reticular formation. Remember, the reticular formation is the part of the brain that wakes you up, versus melatonin from the pineal gland that induces sleepiness. what the liver does, and what happens to our metabolic rate. So pretty much, for all intents and purposes, epinephrine and norepinephrine work the same, and together. I don't ask you to distinguish them, but where they differ a little bit is in the blood vessels. But ultimately, together, they help vasodilate to certain regions, so you deliver a lot of blood to certain areas of the body, and vasoconstrict and inhibit it from going to other areas of the body. So I would, over and over again, always repeat to yourself the different responses, maybe the different receptors, the different neurotransmitters, or in this case, epinephrine and norepinephrine, part of the endocrine system that works in the sympathetic nervous system, over and over, because once you get that down, it's going to make the application in the nursing program much easier. All right, so this is just comparing and contrasting our responses to short-term stress versus prolonged stress. Short-term stress uses epinephrine and norepinephrine in the sympathetic nervous system. Long-term stress is going to use the cortisol, adrenal corticotropic hormone, from the anterior pituitary to the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And when you look at those, they're very similar in their responses. You still are elevating blood glucose levels. Your heart rate and your blood pressure is generally increased. But one is more of a short-term response, one is a long-term response. That's all I want you to know. I ask you mostly about blood glucose regulation, blood calcium regulation, human growth hormone, and T3, T4. Those are my biggies. Epinephrine and norepinephrine for autonomic nervous system for sure. We will look at it again in more detail. Antidiuretic and aldosterone again for like the third or fourth time when we get to the urinary system. Okay, now moving to the pancreas, located posterior to the stomach. We said it's a retroperitoneal organ, so it's not technically within the abdominal pelvic cavity, but in the level of the stomach, posterior to it. Right, it has two regions to it. It's a dual function organ. Part of it functions as an exocrine gland because it's going to produce digestive enzymes, that pass through the pancreatic duct into the small intestine. And other regions called the pancreatic islets, which are pale staining clusters of cells in the pancreas, produce insulin and glucagon. And those hormones go into the bloodstream. All right. So here it's a very magnified picture, but this will be an islet of Langerhans. There are alpha and beta cells there and delta cells as well. But we're going to be looking at blood glucose regulation, alpha and beta cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon. Beta cells produce insulin. You're not going to have to ever look at a slide and distinguish which is the alpha or the beta. You just have to know that that is the whole organ is a pancreas. That as a unit is an islet of Langerhans or a pancreatic islet. Maybe that you do have alpha and beta cells there, which hormones they produce, and what would be the negative feedback mechanism of them. For instance, someone could point to that islet of Langerhans and just say, what cell will be stimulated when you have higher than normal blood glucose levels? Well, you're going to secrete insulin, so that would be the beta cell that's stimulated. Now, what's the hormone that's liberated when you have insulin? Or what's the response? Decreased blood calcium and blood glucose levels. All right, so let's look at those loops before we get too into it. Glucagon. The stimulus for glucagon is lower than normal blood glucose levels or hypoglycemia. Remember, glucose, everything has a normal range. When it drops too low, we release glucagon. The production site are the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets, or the alpha cells in the pancreas. It targets the liver primarily to break down that glycogen and increase blood glucose levels. Now, look, if that is not enough to increase your blood glucose levels, because let's say you're exercising for a long period of time, you start breaking down lipids, thankfully, and you start burning fat. You reap a lot of energy from breaking down lipids. Insulin the stimulus for the release is reversed. Hyperglycemia or elevated or higher than normal blood glucose levels. Production started those beta cells of the islets of Langerhans or pancreatic islets. Targets all body cells, skeletal muscle, and the liver, because now is the time to take up glucose into the cells. They need to have a good store of glucose to use in the mitochondria to produce ATP. The liver will take all those building blocks and create a polysaccharide of glycogen and store it for later, for when blood glucose levels fall below normal levels. We store it in muscle, right, so that we'll have it a source of ATP or substrate readily available as skeletal muscle contracts, to convert to ATP for further muscle contraction. And thus we decrease blood glucose levels, hopefully back to a normal range. Okay, disorders. We have two types of disorders. We have diabetes mellitus, diabetes 1, diabetes 2. So diabetes mellitus, we have type 1 and type 2. They have similar effects, so to speak, but their etiology of the causes is different. Type 1 is an autoimmune disorder. It's autoimmune disease that destroys the beta cells. Maybe not all of them. The degree to which you make these antibodies may vary in an individual. All right, so this is generally something you're born with frequently, juvenile onset, even infancy onset. Right. So type 1 means you're making antibodies and you're killing, a significant number of beta cells. So you're not producing a lot of insulin and your glucose levels are chronically too high. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is generally an adult onset. All right, so it may be due to pharmacology, it may be due to different drugs you're taking, but it's often due to the fact that you've had, for years, a high carbohydrate diet, where you're producing, and there's a lot of glucose and monosaccharides in the bloodstream that's stimulating a lot of insulin to be secreted. And after a while, those beta cells kind of burn out and start to die off. All right, so if you change your diet frequently, you can address this. But so due to a long history of elevated blood glucose levels, those beta cells kind of start to burn out and some of them start to die off and they just don't produce insulin. Or I should say, it could be a combination of both. The cell's receptors to insulin no longer respond to insulin because you've had it for so long and they're just like, we've got enough glucose inside our cell. We don't need any more. So they just start to become immune to it, or they actually even downregulate. It's called, they start taking down some of the receptors to insulin from the surface of the cell. And so they become insulin resistant in that way. All right, so type 1 versus type 2. And the pharmacology applied to these two disorders are different. I will tell you that generally type 2, for many people, not all, but many, this can be resolved by really just changing the diet. Okay, so there are a triad of symptoms associated with diabetes mellitus: polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. Polyuria means increased urination, polydipsia, increased thirst, and polyphagia, increased hunger. Classic 3. So this just shows you, kind of the stimulus for glucagon and insulin, balancing blood glucose levels. Normal blood glucose levels, are about 90 to 100 milligrams, or about 90. A fasting blood glucose is about 70 to 100 milligrams per 100 milliliters, or per milligrams per deciliter. Other endocrine structures. Well, we have the pineal gland that produces melatonin. It helps regulate, it responds to changing levels of ambient light. Melatonin induces sleepiness. So when it gets dark out, we should be secreting melatonin to induce sleepiness and allow our body to rest when it's dark out. And that's because we can't see in the dark, and your body has to rest at some point. So we take cover generally in sleep when it's dark, and this hormone helps induce that. And then we wake up our brain is stimulated when the sun comes up, because the reticular activating system responds to increased ambient light levels and stimulates your brain to wake up. So it's time to go to work while you can see everything in your environment. The thymus gland, as you know, produces thymosin to activate T lymphocyte maturation. Remember, the heart produces H1 natriuretic peptide. So that's the only one that we'll study that is in response to elevated blood pressure and blood volume levels. Kidney produces erythropoietin to increase red blood cell production. It targets the red bone marrow. The gastrointestinal tract, remember, well, we're going to look at that. I keep saying remember, but that's the next chapter. We're going to look at some of the hormones of in the small intestine and the stomach. Gastrin, CCK, and secretin. Vitamin T from the skin. We can convert that to the active form of calcitriol. And then we have hormones, reproductive organs that produce reproductive or sex hormones, and hormones associated with pregnancy. We'll look at those more when we get to the reproductive system. But there are some other structures, some of them we've looked at, are familiar with, more than half of them. But they're good to know anyway. This chart shows you some disorders associated with the thyroid gland. I was telling you that the hyper and hyposecretion ones I wanted you to know was Graves' disease, and Hashimoto's disease is the other kind of hypothyroid autoimmune disorder. I think they're good to review. And what the difference is between the autoimmune disorders and the other disorders. For instance, a simple goiter. A goiter just means you have a swollen or enlarged thyroid gland. But you can have what's called simple goiter, and that's usually due to a dietary insufficiency of iodine. So when you don't have enough iodine to form those, T3, T4, the 3 iodine molecule T3 or the 4 iodine molecule T4, you are sending a lot of thyroid stimulating hormone down to that organ, and it just, to those follicular cells, and they just can't make that, it doesn't have the iodine in your diet to make those molecules. And because the levels then remain low of T3, T4, your anterior pituitary is still sending out thyroid stimulating hormone. And it causes the thyroid gland, it keeps telling it to go, 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 and it can't make anything because you don't get enough iron. There's not enough available iron. So usually if you can, as long as you can address this early, is you just add iodine to your diet, that will often resolve itself. And that's the nice thing about dietary insufficiencies, is if it can be recognized fairly early before there's too much harm associated with it, is that you just start adding it to the diet and you see it resolve itself. All right, that is the end of the endocrine system.